Welcome to episode 1 of the Common Cultures Podcast. I'm your host, Simon Eisenbach, and I am here with our guest, Felecia Maxfield-Barrett. And she is the president of Utah Global Diplomacy.
Yes.
Thank you for letting me come to your office and chat with you.
Thanks for inviting me.
To start out, give me a quick, 3-sentence, what it is that you do for a profession.
Oh, that's a really good question, because I can tell you what the organization does.
We're going to get back to that later. I just want the brief overview to start.
Where we're gonna myself.
Yes.
As you. Okay. So what I do as a profession is I'm a connector. I want to be able to put people who can do really amazing things together in the same space to just simply meet each other and shake hands and sit down together and share ideas and best practices and see what happens. Have it be this incredible human experiment on how can we create things bigger and better and more innovative just because we share ideas. Awesome. So that's my profession.
Cool.
Yeah.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with a quick lightning round that's going to kind of serve as the base of our conversation.
Okay.
So the first question is, how would you define community? This is your definition, not the dictionary definition.
Right. Community is for me, and I actually don't think that I had a community up until a few years ago, probably about 8 years ago, when I was working for Wasatch Community Gardens. Because before I was working in government, and it was very segmented. Everybody was in it for themselves, trying to move into higher positions. And so it wasn't until I went to go work for Wasatch Community Gardens that I went, wait a minute, this is a group of people that, regardless of how weird I was as someone, they just accepted me. Yeah. And found that common space where we could just coexist in the same space. And so for me, I left there feeling like I had a tribe. And so any place that I'm at where I feel like I have a tribe that I can connect into, for me, that's the definition of community. Cool.
And how would you define sustainability?
Oh, sustainability for me is that ability to move forward. Progress is really what it is. It's that moving forward, advancing. That's the sustainability. As long as there can be movement around an idea, a location, growth, then it's always going to develop. And if it can develop, it can sustain.
Awesome. And in your ideal world, what would a sustainable community look like?
Yeah, so taking those two ideas, it would be how can a tribe or that common group of people continue to grow and welcome more people in? It definitely means that there's going to be conflict, and there's going to be different values, and there's going to be disagreement, but that's okay. Totally. Disagreement is not a bad thing.
No, if you don't have disagreement, you don't have a checks and balances.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it can be said true about democracy as well. Democracy is this really slow progression of ideas, but it's meant to live in this very difficult, contentious space, because then you advance the best of what everybody has to offer. Yeah. And I feel like that is the definition of sustainable community. How do you take the best that everybody has to offer and advance that? Are we there as a society? I feel like we've taken a big step back on when it comes to sustainable community in that sense. I don't feel like we're advancing at all.
That's fair.
But that might be a discussion for another episode, maybe today. I don't know.
We'll see where it goes.
Okay.
So you were born and raised in Utah, correct?
Yes.
What was it like growing up in Utah?
It was very interesting for the fact that being a child in the 80s,
yes,
being from Utah County, I'm originally from American Fork.
Okay.
I did not grow up as LDS. I was
Okay.
not part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Rather, I was a Pentecostal.
Okay.
And if you know anything about Pentecostals, it is definitely the, speaking in tongues, and you're filled with the Holy Spirit, and you're rolling on the floor.
Very charismatic.
Yeah. That's one word for it, right? Which is completely different than other more traditional faiths.
Totally.
In fact, I even remember when I was in high school, I took a humanities class, and the assignment was we had to go to a church that was different than the church that we grew up in.
Okay.
So my church, being very charismatic, being very filled with joy, and you said hallelujah and praise the Lord, and you were dancing, and they had a tambourine and the guitar, right?
Did you go to a Lutheran church?
I went to the Lutheran church because I was so fascinated by the sense of tradition.
Yes.
And what did not being filled with the Holy Spirit, but still being able to praise a God in a very loving way, what did that look like? And so when I turned in my report, I remember my humanities teacher was like, I don't get this. But she didn't ask for us to give any kind of background on who we were and why we would come through.
Got it.
Right? And so she didn't realize that going to a Lutheran church was a diverse experience for me based off of being Pentecostal in Utah County in the 80s, right? And so it was a very interesting time. Definitely some bullying experiences.
Yeah.
Learning, it developed a character for me.
In your school, were you very much an outlier because you were not LDS?
I would say that I was the outlier. Whether or not it was because I was LDS is something, and I don't know, right? I think it was because I had an older brother who was very weird, and he sort of laid the path for me of being
classic sibling.
That, right? Yeah. My 8th grade English teacher saw my name and looked at me, and she was like, "Is your brother so and so?" And I was like, "Yep." And she's like, "Oh, good Lord." I was like, "Okay, here we go."
That's a way to start. What types of hobbies did you have when you were younger?
So in high school, it was all about music.
Okay.
And
what did you play?
Well, I didn't play anything. It was, being 16 and coming up to Salt Lake, I participated in Confetti's, which was like this gothic club for 16-year-olds where 16-year-olds could go and smoke. And,
Interesting.
So
never
music,
heard of this?
Oh, yeah.
No, I've never heard of this.
Okay, so in Sugar House, Utah, right?
Yeah.
You got 21st South, and you have 9th East, and there's a Walgreens and a McDonald's. Okay, so where Walgreens is, used to be this club called Confetti's.
Okay.
And and it was like the only dance club where they would allow 16-year-old kids to go into. Everywhere else you had to either be 18, 21, right?
Yeah.
They didn't serve alcohol there.
Got it.
But it was like this alternative, goth, industrial dance club.
That is wild to me to think about, like, back in like all the stories you hear about, like, everything being so rigid.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no,
wow.
It was, and that's where all of the kids went, and it's where you could be free and independent and your own self. And I think, going back to the question of community, being an outlier in American Fork and being the weird kid, that's where I found community was at this dance club. Yeah. Right?
What was your favorite genre of music at that time?
Oh, I don't know that I would say I had a favorite genre, but I definitely had a favorite musician.
Okay.
And of course it was Morrissey, which I would say Morrissey is better than the Smiths. I know that's very controversial. But it was more of that, like, it was that. But fast forward 3 years, I was friends with this group of kids because eventually Confetti shuts down. Then they opened Area 51. Okay. And this group of kids that I was running around with, for some reason, all of us being in Provo, Utah, we thought we were British. And so it was all about British pop, right? Britpop. So Pulp, Blur, Stone Roses, Charlatans UK. It was all about that.
That's not what I was expecting.
No, right? Yeah. So I mean, the hobby was hanging out with friends and listening to music and going dancing at these dance clubs. I mean, I was part of the tech crew in high school drama.
Okay.
Because I didn't have enough confidence to actually get from behind the stage to move onto a stage.
But honestly, being behind the scenes stuff is just as important as...
Right. Oh, yeah.
So what did you feel like you learned doing all of that you could bring into like the next phase of life?
I didn't actually learn a whole lot. And part of it was because I had a very strict curfew growing up.
Gotcha.
And so even after a play was completely done and the tech crew has to come together and they have to dismantle the whole sets and put everything away, like my curfew was 10 o'clock on a weekend. And so I had to...
How many times did you try to break that as a kid?
I didn't. I was such a good kid. In fact, I didn't miss school on senior slough day.
Oh, man.
And it was because I had like 3 AP tests that day, so I went to school anyway. I never smoked. I never drank. Even though I had this really good friend. If she ever saw this, she'd kill me. But I had this really good friend in high school where you go to Confetti's. Yeah. Everybody smokes there because it's the 90s at that point. Yeah, everybody smoked in the 90s. And
even if you didn't smoke, you got secondhand smoke because...
Exactly. So she was not allowed to go to dance clubs in high school, but she would sneak out and go to the dance club with me and come home just reeking of smoke. Yeah. And she would tell her parents that I was the one smoking, even though I didn't smoke. And I was like, oh, no wonder why your parents hated me. Because not only am I an outlier and Protestant.
And you're the influence.
And going to a dance club, because my parents were okay with that. And
That's funny.
Yeah.
So after high school, what did you go to college for? Where did you go to college?
So and I'll tell you my college story because I think it is. I personally, it took me a really long time to figure out that there was a lesson in my college story. Okay. So growing up, my parents wanting their kids to do better than themselves, right? So what that meant for my parents was that I shouldn't get pregnant in high school and I should graduate. Because that's where the bar was set. That would be doing better than what they did. Got it. Right? And so I graduate from high school and I'm like, well, what am I going to do? Well, everybody says to go to college. Okay, great. I'm going to go to college. And so I pack up my little Ford Festiva with all the stuff that I can possibly put in a little roller skate. And I had, because of being part of tech crew in high school, I had been on the campus of Southern Utah University. Okay. And so I drive my car down there and I go into a counselor's office and I say, hey, I was told to go to college. I'm here. Now what do I do? And she's like, what are you talking about? What do you do? And I'm like, well, I'm guessing I have to register for classes. I need a job because I have no money. And can you help me find a place to live?
Did you just go down there not even applying for school?
So I had enough sense to apply for school. Okay. Right? And it was the only school I applied to and I got in. Got it. So I did something right. And I don't even remember how I knew I had to apply. I think I heard it from somebody that you had to do that. Got it. But didn't register for classes, didn't have a place to live, didn't have a job, had no money, right? Nothing. Yeah. And she took enough pity on me, sympathy, compassion, empathy, right? Yeah. To sit down with me for 4.5 hours and together she helped me fill out student loan papers and she helped me register for classes. And let me tell you, when you register for college classes the day before they start, you're going to end up getting things like 1800 Chinese history and I remember it was a level 400 creative writing class.
At 7 a.m. on a Monday.
Right, exactly. And the first week I was in that class, the professor had me stay afterwards and he's like, you do not belong here. Like this class is by far more advanced than you are at this point. Yeah. And I remember pleading with him because I had to have a certain amount of credits to keep my student loans. Yeah. that I was like, I get it. I fully understand I shouldn't be here. This is my situation. Can you just put me on a pass fail? And by the grace of God, he passed me, but I'm pretty sure it was like, let's just get you. Yeah. Ended up getting a job at a call center, because in Cedar City you had 3 choices. You could work at the call center, you could work at Denny's, or you could work at a music store. And so call center was where I started out. Eventually I went to go work for the music store.
I was going to say, I could see you going to the music store.
Yeah. And then I was able to get an apartment, and luckily it was an apartment with a friend, because the advisor was like, well, where, do you have anyone else going to school here? I'm like, yeah, I've got a couple of friends here. And she's like, yeah, let's put you with them, so you've got a support system.
There you go.
But it really made me realize that we take, and especially for young people these days, that we take words for granted.
Yeah.
We say, go do this, go to college, but we don't actually sit down to say, how do you go to college?
Or why do you go to college?
Right, exactly. Somebody should have said, you need to wait a year to figure out what it is that you want to do.
I mean, I almost went straight into 4-year school, and I, because of bowling, actually decided to go to community college, because the school I went to had a bowling team, and I was I basically was auto on the bowling team, and so I ended up going to community college 5 miles from my childhood house.
Oh,
and so
amazing!
It was one of those that that saved me a lot of money too.
Right? Yeah, I did not save a lot of money, because it took me 8 years to finally graduate from college. Yeah.
So what was your first major that you went in to good?
So I actually didn't. So the story being, I only stayed down in Cedar City for a year. I ended up going to, it was Utah Valley State College at the time, Utah Valley University. So I moved back up to Provo, Orem, stayed around there. And then eventually I moved up to the University of Utah. And there I met my boyfriend, who's now my husband. His mom worked for the Department of Workforce Services. And she said, if you can get a job with the state of Utah, they have a tuition reimbursement program. Yeah. And so I got a job working for the unemployment office, and they paid for my school. And by that time, I'm like, okay, I have enough of what you would consider to be an associate's degree. Now I've got to buckle down. Someone is actually paying for my college, because up until then it had been, will you work a semester, you go a semester, right? Yeah. Completely lost, no guidance. And I said, well, I've always wanted to be an archaeologist. So I enrolled in the anthropology department up at the U. Realized really quickly that archaeology wasn't going to be my future for different reasons that I don't want to get into.
That's fair. It also feels like a very niche field that not a lot of people can really make a living.
In Utah, you can. In Utah, you definitely can. Niche for sure, 100%. But it was more of like, I just met my boyfriend, and then we were getting married, and my husband didn't want me to be away for 10 months out of the year going on archaeological digs. I'm like, I get it.
What the big deal is. Honestly, that sounds spectacular.
Yeah. We sort of liked each other. We still do.
I mean, he wanted to actually spend time with you.
Right, exactly. And so I finished up getting my degree in anthropology, and I emphasized in storytelling. I thought, listening, my dad is a storyteller, or was a storyteller, and he would the funniest stories, but there was always this lesson learned. Yeah. Whether it was good or bad was a different situation, but there was always something to be learned. And so I'm like, I really want to listen to stories. And then when I graduated, I'm like, well, I want to do something with an anthropology degree. Yeah. What do I do with that? And so I had. Okay, so here's the irony of going and studying about a Lutheran church is my husband actually was Lutheran, right? Okay. So I go to a Lutheran church, and the one Sunday that I'm there, they have this choir that was there. It was not the traditional choir that they had, but rather it was a choir from Sudan. Interesting. And it was the most beautiful music I had ever heard, and it was the most beautiful people that I had seen. And if you've ever heard Sudan, and so this is before South Sudan was a country. Okay. So it was Sudanese. the way that they sing is there's these very interesting pitches, there's these interesting chants, there's these interesting tones, and it was just hypnotic to me.
Congolese music is very similar.
Exactly. Yeah. And so afterwards, they have coffee hour down in the basement of the church. I went up to this gentleman, and he had these very interesting scars on his face, tribal scars, and he was incredibly tall. He was about 7 feet tall. And I said, "You've got to tell me who you are and where you came from. Like, I'm just very curious." And his name was James, and he actually became one of my favorite people on the face of the planet. Told me that he was a lost boy from Sudan and why he left Sudan and how, as a refugee, he made it over to Utah. And now he works with refugees with Catholic Community Services as a case manager.
Yeah.
Tell me about refugees. Who exactly are you?
Yeah.
And, who are refugees? What makes somebody a refugee? Very rudimental questions.
But this is where you started to have like a shift in like mindset.
Exactly. Because I'm like, okay, that is a very interesting story that you're telling me.
Yeah.
We've got these incredible cultures that are here from all over the world, and growing up, again, Utah in the 80s, we were not known as a global society here.
Correct.
We were very homogenous.
Yes.
I'm like, so what you're telling me is that I can work with a global community here in Utah without having to leave my husband, who I just got married to, and do some social good. And he was like, yeah, absolutely. And so I went home, I did some research, and I figured out that Department of Workforce Services, where I was working, had just formed a new refugee-focused team.
Got it.
So the Refugee Services Office, but then refugee employment, and then refugee eligibility, which would help with food stamps and Medicaid and right.
Yeah.
And so I went from working in unemployment over to eligibility, and then made my way over to the refugee team, and then that's where it all started.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And how long did you work in that space with the government?
So I worked with I started in 2007, and I worked for eligibility a few years. Then I moved over to the refugee services team for a few years. And then I went back to school, got my master's in public administration.
Was that while you were still working?
Yes. Yeah. And I took some nonprofit classes, and I was like, wait a minute, nonprofit work, that's really where change happens.
Yeah.
Really incredible grassroots.
Especially a lot of small targeted nonprofits.
Exactly, yeah. And so then some people would say that I was arrogant. Maybe it's true. Maybe I was confident. I don't know. But I had been doing some work with a nonprofit just on a volunteer basis with the Refugee Services Office.
Yeah.
And I said, well, I've got a master's degree now. Let me be the executive director. And they said, well, we're hiring an executive director. We've got $30,000 in the bank. So if you come and you be the director, you have to figure out a way to pay yourself. And I said, okay, I can do it, not knowing any better. And I became an executive director. And so I worked in the refugee area from 2007 to about 2013.
Got it.
Yeah.
With that change, what did you learn to like help you grow into your next phase of life? Let me think on that just for a second. Yeah.
And I'll just tell you like the transition into the next phase of life. It was that I became a new mom.
Yeah.
And being an executive director of a nonprofit, I had been putting in 60, 70 hours. I think because of the financial situation, I was getting paid for like 15, 20 hours at most.
Yeah.
Being a new mom, I just couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah,
it was so exhausting, right?
Yeah, that's a hard thing to undertake for any executive director, never mind like running an organization and also learning how to be a parent.
Yeah, exactly. And so I resigned And then I took a volunteer position being an intern with Wasatch Community Gardens, documenting their history and doing some oral history projects, doing their events and their volunteer coordination. And that's where I learned that you can have empathy for others, that it wasn't, not everything had to be politically driven. Not everything had to be a fight for resources or claiming your space, that there could be collaboration. And then in that collaboration and in that acceptance, you know, that's where you find that community and that tribe, and you know that we can be friends and we can all get along.
Like with collaboration, you end up going further than you would otherwise. Yeah,
and I think that that's a different mind shift in general for the philanthropic world than what it looked like 10 years ago. 10 years ago, it was, this is my grant, these are my resources, these are my volunteers.
Even
I don't want to share.
Even 5 years ago, and I also feel like that happens more in larger cities, where even though there's a lot more resources, people feel like everybody's out to get them.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the difference.
Salt Lake's a small city in the grand scheme of a lot of cities, but like I've had conversations with a bunch of people in big mega cities, and they all very much feel like it's like me versus them a lot of times.
Yeah, right? You know, and research is starting to show that no, there is really incredible work and impact that can happen, and there are more abundance and resources when you do collaborate with each other. And so, so that would be the difference between now and then in terms of just the difference of working in a global atmosphere here in Utah versus what I'm experiencing now in a global atmosphere here in Utah.
And when did you start getting involved with Utah Global Diplomacy?
It was in 2016 is when I was hired. So I had a friend who was the executive director at Utah Global Diplomacy, and she said, I had worked with her previously through the refugee community, and she's like, come work for me. You will love this organization because it is unlike any other nonprofit you've ever experienced before. And at Wasatch, I had some projects that I was working on, and I'm like, no, it's not time. And then it was time, and so I came over here. I had never heard of this organization, which is so true for who we are. We are Utah's best kept secret. But once I found out about the extraordinary work that we do, I was immediately hooked. It was a good nonprofit that had been around for a long amount of time. It had solid policies. I had a really dedicated staff and a dedicated volunteer community. And as soon as I started, I was like, yes, this is where I belong. About maybe 6 months into the job, her husband was military, and she came to me and said, hey, I'm moving to Germany with my husband because he got posted there. You should become the executive director. I said, hell no. I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that.
A little bit scarred.
Right, exactly. I'm like, I'm tired. I just found some work-life balance with my child. My child was, I think, 3 by this time. But I had a really good conversation with a close friend that is associated with this organization. And he gave me some really good advice. And so I threw my hat in the ring, and I want to say that there was like 200 other people that interviewed, that had applied for this job. And even still, I'll talk to somebody, and they'll be like, oh, I applied for your job. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry you didn't get it. I'm glad that I did, right? But I went through the process, and that was 6 years ago, and now I'm here.
And in your time here, how do you see the growth of the organization?
So going back to the comment that I made about how we are Utah's best kept secret, the previous executive directors, wonderful ladies who did such a good job on creating solid policies, processes, good board of directors, good strategic planning. laid the foundation for me, which I'm a bull in a china shop. Like let's really shake things up and do some cool stuff, to come in and say, wait a minute, what we do here in building global connections between the people of Utah and people from around the world is so exciting. How come we don't have more opportunities for people to get involved? And so we started, under my leadership, we've grown in terms of creating more entry points for people to get involved. So that could be our International Leadership Academy, where we help young people get jobs in international relations. We've switched from doing a monthly lecture series to these full-day symposium series that are tackling some of the world's and Utah's most pressing issues, by bringing really interesting people together to the same table to talk about how does business, government, nonprofit sectors intersect on these issues. Looking at how do we expand opportunities to volunteer? What does the idea of citizen diplomacy, which is such a basic idea that because of the work you do and I do, and somebody who say works as a nurse or a teacher, we all play because we are such an internationally connected community. We're all ambassadors. We're all
and they
diplomats.
all have such different backgrounds.
Right, exactly.
And different connections and different interests and
So, how do we get the broader community to start thinking about being that citizen diplomat, that you have a responsibility when you're engaging with people from around the world to represent you as a person and your values, your state, your country? Like, that's a big responsibility.
That's true.
Yeah.
It's crazy to think about.
Yeah. Right? Yeah. And at the same time, like, it's such a Pollyanna concept, right? It's like, yeah, we can all make the world a better place. But I truly believe that if people just, again, going back to our conversation, if people can just come together through a connection and sit down and share ideas and best practices and get to know each other as people, then what happens is it fills this void with empathy, and all of a sudden we have a friend from another country, a culture. And then, what that does is when there is a conflict or when there is a question, it allows us to approach each other in the most respectful way to find a solution or to find the answer.
Do you think that the lack of authentic conversation and deep, meaningful conversation is part of the disconnect that we're seeing in a lot of society today?
100%. And COVID exacerbated that. So when COVID happened, we had really good conversations going on. Definitely some division going on. But then when COVID happened, what that allowed us to do was to go into this hibernation state. Where we could sit behind a desk or we could sit behind a computer screen and we could make comments anonymously, that if we wanted to engage with each other, there was still that disconnect of that, face-to-face conversation, those subtle nuances that you get from having an in-person meeting.
And you also had the ability to have a digital echo chamber.
Yes.
It was so much easier to I don't want to think about that, so I'm only going to listen to things over here.
Yes.
And I feel like that's part of it too, is that truly exacerbated some of the disconnect.
Right? Yeah. And you look at different social media platforms where people would get into these arguments and then defriend each other. Because we didn't validate what each other said or because we disagreed. And it's so easy to be so cruel anonymously or behind typed words. Whereas if we just sat down together, we could say, I understand where you're coming from. I disagree with you, but I understand where you're coming from. Now let me explain it. It was that hibernation that really disconnected us. Now what we're trying to do is bring people back together face to face so that it can create that sense of empathy. And through that empathy, that is going to be the quickest path to peace.
It's fair.
Yeah.
And what are you guys working on that would bring people together in the near future?
Well, I'll give you an example. So, because we've always been working on that face-to-face connection, and
I don't know if you had symposiums or anything in the near future.
Yeah,
or like topical.
Yeah. So, and I can talk about it, but to give you an example, through our exchange programs, what is going on between Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah.
Horrible, right? We see it on the television, we read about it in the news. You know, we know that our Congress is having huge budget conversations whether or not they're going to support foreign aid for Ukraine.
Or even the U.S. at this point.
Right. Yes, we're a little worried about our budget getting passed in March. But it was the week before the war broke out. We had a delegation here that was from Ukraine, and they were here on LGBTQ issues.
Okay.
So we were taking them around to different meetings, and I remember there was this one delegate where she really wanted American cream cheese. Right? She had heard about it. She had never tasted it before. Yeah. She's like, "Will you please take me to the grocery store? I have to get bagels and cream cheese while I'm here in America."
Okay.
Yes, of course. So we just go up the road to Macy's, and we go to the general part of the dairy section where they have a cream cheese. We get it. We get the bagels. And I'm like, well, let's just go check out the gourmet cheeses, because there might be something a little bit better than cream cheese that you might want to try. And we're walking through the gourmet section, and she holds up this round disc of cheese, and she's like, "This is from Ukraine. This is our equivalent of cream cheese. What is it doing in your gourmet section?" And I was
That's so funny.
You've got to be kidding. Like, really?
So like our cream cheese would be in their gourmet section, and their
right? And so it was that little nuance, right? Fast forward a couple of days later, we have to put the delegation on the plane to go back to Ukraine. And it's the day before the airports are going to close down.
Oh.
And we don't know what they're going back to.
Yeah.
They're scared. We're scared for them. You know, we're talking to them about, hey, you know, these might be some possibilities we're willing to look at. And they said no, because their community is back home in Ukraine. And what that did is it you know, instead of talking about these eagle-eye views of what was going on over in that region of the world, it brought it down to the most personal level, where I think of Ukraine and I think about my friend, and I go, is she okay? What is she dealing with? You know, what is her family dealing with? What are people who are part of the LGBT community dealing with there in an already, you know, in a war-torn country now, you know, already having to deal with social stigmas.
Yeah.
It just makes it very human.
Yeah.
Right? That's what we do in bringing people together, is we give the human face to these global conflicts, to geopolitics.
Yeah.
That it makes it very personal, right?
Yeah.
So we do that through our exchange programs, but then we also want to do the same thing through just everyday conversations and dialogue. So we do our symposium series. You know, the 4 symposiums that we are doing this year is, you know, the Unveiled Lens. What does freedom of journalism look like?
Okay.
Building global impact by capacity building through nonprofits.
Okay.
Bridging religious divides and the women's role in that conversation.
Okay.
And then we always do, it's called the Global Changemaker Symposium, which is for high school, college, and career-ready young adults. And it's, you know, again, how do these global issues have a local impact here in Utah, and why should we care?
I have someone that might be a good speaker for your journalism one.
Okay.
I'll give it to you after.
Yeah, definitely.
How do you think that working in this capacity that's really impactful in a lot of ways has changed you personally?
I don't know that it's changed me, because I've always been a Pollyanna. I've always believed that there's some ugliness in the world for sure. There's no doubt about it. But I feel like the ugliness gets exacerbated by news, media, right? It's always going to rise to the top, right?
Yeah.
Do I think that there's more good in the world happening? 100%. So do I think that the world can be a better place? 100%, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, a couple of things that are really exciting. me being from Utah, and I've only done a little bit of global traveling, I've been able to meet people from 163 different countries around the world.
Wild.
Just through the jobs that I've had.
Yeah.
Working with refugees and then here.
Yeah.
Even hosting countries that I had no idea was a country. So like Timor-Leste, had no idea that was a country. San Marino, no idea that was a country.
Were you confused when people came from Georgia?
No, I was not. And my husband and I were actually looking at doing a bike ride in Georgia. A friend had sent us a link, and he was like, our friend wants us to go do a bike ride in Georgia. I'm not really sure I want to do that.
Yeah.
Seems pretty flat. And I'm like, it's Georgia the country, not Georgia the state. And he was like, oh, okay, right. So I always ask, I always clarify.
There's some ridiculous skiing in Georgia, too.
Is there really?
Yeah.
They get snow in Georgia?
They get snow in Georgia.
I had no idea.
The country.
Oh, okay. See,
yeah, the country.
Yeah, like it's gorgeous land there, right?
Yeah.
You know, so I think if anything, this job, the way that I grow is that this job keeps teaching me.
Yeah.
It keeps teaching me about geography, about geopolitics, about our history of our country, and how interesting diplomacy has been addressed. You know, an example is, and I bet you didn't know this, it wasn't until the 1970s that married women were allowed to be foreign service officers.
Did not know that.
The 70s, if you chose to be married.
It was the 60s before you could have a bank account as a woman in the U.S., if I recall.
Right.
So, like, nothing really surprises me with restrictions of rights.
Right. Exactly.
As far as, like, when things came up. Because really, the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement were, like, hand in hand of, like, step laddering, essentially trying to help one another get to where it is today.
Right. And even within that ladder, that not everybody got to step up on those ladder steps at the same time equally.
Totally.
You know, and it's because that's so fresh in our history that we still have so much further to grow and learn and develop. And we take steps back.
A year and a half before the last parts of the U.S. after the Civil War were informed that the war ended and slavery was now illegal. Because the local establishment was just like, we're not going to change anything. Yeah. So it's just exacerbated throughout. Yeah. People don't want to let go of power.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that I found that we're really good at is creating this platform to be able to bring people that don't have access to equality and inclusion to be able to step on that platform and amplify their voices. That is what we can offer to others around us in Utah that are trying to address pressing issues as well. Because again, we're connectors. We're not doing the frontline work. We're not resettling refugees, and we're not helping the homeless, and we're not addressing climate change. Rather, what we do is we bring those who are on that front line to a place where we can help them build their capacity, talk about their work, and empower them. And that is sustainability as well. Yeah. You know, instead of us going and saying, you know, what would be really good is if you did this, we're helping them come to their own conclusions and say, this is what's going to be best for my community, my country. Yeah.
That's smart.
Yeah.
In your ideal, what does Utah look like in 10 years?
I love Utah. I do too. A big ambassador, right?
I'm new to the area, but I love it here.
Yeah. What do they say that Salt Lake City is what people think Denver looks like?
Probably.
Right, which means that we're better than Denver.
I mean, the fact that you're less than an hour from mountains, whereas if you're in Denver, you're still an hour or 2 hours from mountains.
Yeah. So when I think about Utah, And some interesting statistics is that 1 in 5 jobs are related to international relations or foreign trade here.
Wild.
Right? Crazy.
I also know that Utah has the most nonprofits in the U.S.
Yeah, so the last time I looked, it was 10,000, but I think that was even before COVID.
Jesus.
So who knows? Yeah, 10,000 registered nonprofits. We speak more than 130 different languages there. We are this incredible hub for the economy, for innovation.
Yeah.
We have this amazing culture here.
Dude, the food culture is unreal.
Yeah, right? We're just a naturally caring community. We're definitely globally curious. I think, are there outliers? Of course there are.
Everywhere has that.
But I think we're curious and we're welcoming, and we want to see people succeed. We want to make sure that people have access to opportunity. And so in 10 years, and especially if we get to host the Olympics again, I think we're going to be well prepared to be that welcoming community to the world.
Yeah.
Just a better version of what we are today.
10 years would be when the Olympics. 10 years right now is when the Olympics would be happening.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't even think about that. Like, that was now part of me asking the question. Like, that'll be literally right now happening.
Yeah, right? I know, 10 years. So, which is a short amount of time to do a lot of work.
Yeah.
But again, it goes back to your original question of what is community and what is sustainable community. And I think, the fact that we do have community here now, how do we as people, regardless of our values, regardless of what we see, we all want the same things. And we had talked about this previously. You want your basic needs met.
Yep.
You want access to education.
Yep.
Right?
And then you want your kids to have a better education than you have.
Right, exactly. And then was there a third thing?
The joy in life.
Joy in life, right? So how we get there might, we might take different roads.
Totally.
But as long as we are progressing as a person, we're moving forward, that's going to be sustainable. And how awesome of that a state can say that we have a sustainable community based on those two factors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be rad.
Yeah, right?
What do you want to be doing in 10 years?
Oh, I'm going to be retired in 10 years.
Well, but there's other things besides work. Like, you could be...
Yeah, so, well...
Are you going to be off hiking all the high peaks in the state?
Well, so I'm going to be in Moab. I'm going to be living in Moab.
Okay.
I'm going to be... cycling a lot, rafting a lot, running a lot.
Nice.
That was the whole goal, is when my daughter turns 18, we're going to retire to Moab. We already have a house down there, which we're super excited about.
That's awesome.
But you're right. It doesn't mean retirement in the traditional sense, because through these exchange programs, the State Department is always looking for liaisons or interpreters to travel with the groups around the United States.
Yeah.
I think that sounds like an amazingly fun retirement project. And then because of my passion with seeing nonprofits succeed, like maybe it's doing some consulting work or some contract work and, helping to build again community for nonprofits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay.
Is there anything else you want to add?
Just that I would say, it truly can make a difference when people just shake hands.
Yeah.
We talk about citizen diplomacy as that, helping shape foreign relations, and we do it one handshake at a time.
Yeah.
That's the reality of it. That's how we make the world a better place, one handshake at a time.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.